There are 3 things you need to learn a language.
Today we're going to break those down and figure out how to get there.
Let's do that.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to WaiGuo Friends English. If you've watched this channel for some time, you probably understand that we are big into just trying to actually be fluent in a language. And a lot of it basically comes down to don't memorize. Yes, there's going to be some element of memorization that has to be there, but so much of language, so much of communication isn't about remembering certain aspects of language, but it's about being able to use it in a natural context.
There are 3 things that you need in order to get to that. We're going to talk about each of these 3 things here in a list, and then we're going to talk about how can you apply these? How can you realistically study for this, even if you don't live in America, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country? How can you get there?
Number one is vocabulary. For the longest time, I had this dream that if I could just have a superpower so I could download all the words of a language into my brain, then I would be able to be fluent in that language. Unfortunately, that doesn't work like that. However, vocabulary is a very big, real hurdle for a lot of English language learners to overcome because there's 170,000 plus words in our language. And if you try to get that number and you just try to memorize the dictionary, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Well, the odds of you using a word that we don't actually use very often is quite high if you go for 170,000, right? Generally speaking, somebody with a really good vocabulary that actively reads and writes and uses a lot of different words, they're probably somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 words in the total of their active and passive vocabulary. There's probably nobody that does all of the words.
Also, something for you to keep in mind is that there are some words that are just so unused that it would be weird for them to actually come up in a natural conversation. So, for example, some of our students, when they were trying to give themselves names, they would translate their names into English, but unfortunately, the English words that they would choose are English words that none of us would actually be able to use on a regular basis, especially not as a name. So, for example, we had students calling themselves things like graffiti, benevolence, sugar, which was a boy. I am not going to call that boy Sugar because that's not the normal context for that name to be called that way. No, thank you.
But it's not just with names, right? There are situations and contexts in which you would use higher vocabulary versus lower vocabulary. And it's not as complex as it is in other countries or in other languages, okay? This is not something where we use a completely different vocabulary set or where we are not relaxed at all in formal situations. That is not the case. We are fairly laid back in terms of crossing those contexts, but there are words that we tend to use often. There are words that we tend to not use very often. There are words that we only use in writing, and there are words that we only use in speaking. Learning vocabulary, when we say learning vocabulary is very important, we're not meaning sitting down and memorizing everything. We're meaning actually learn them. Learn how we use them. Listen for them. Get good at hearing them in different contexts and understanding what we mean or the shades and nuances of those words. Now, nuance is very difficult. It is an advanced skill that you work on, and you have to keep working on it through functional fluency and beyond. Being able to get all the nuances means learning culture as well. And it also means synonyms. We actually did a whole video on how to study vocabulary effectively in the advanced stages. So it's the Advanced Vocabulary Study Guide. But overall, just know that at the beginning, you're going to be memorizing a lot of vocabulary. As you continue in your English language journey, memorization should not be the key way that you learn vocabulary. You should be learning it in context. And that's what that video is all about.
The second thing that you absolutely need in order to learn a language is grammar. And everybody loves grammar.
No, but we're not talking about proper grammar. Proper grammar is helpful for writing. It's helpful for being able to pass tests and things of that nature. But we're not talking about memorizing grammar patterns and just having those set in place and being able to use them and whip them out at any time. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about spoken grammar. Proper grammar and spoken grammar are very different things. Sometimes they follow general rules, but other times we completely botch the rules in our spoken grammar in order to make a meaning connection. There's figurative and literal meaning, right? And so proper grammar versus spoken grammar really reflects that.
I think that's the biggest distinction that I think that you could make that could really level up your spoken English today, which is to just have that different mindset of this is what is proper and I have to write that on my paper. However, if I speak like that, I'm going to be seen as a weirdo because we don't sound like that in natural English. there's still a lot of grammar inside spoken English. We can't just push it off the table. We actually have to continue to use it, but it just looks different.
Yes. Our program in Fluency Fast Track is built completely on this idea of the difference between proper and spoken grammar, because this is one of the biggest issues we saw in studying for a standardized exam. You're studying proper grammar. In studying through textbooks, you're studying proper grammar. In studying for anything, like in a class or in grammar translation method, you're studying proper grammar. The problem is people who are really good at proper grammar in their own countries, when they come to America, they still cannot communicate very well in person. They can write, they can read, but they will not be able to hold a normal conversation or a deeper conversation or fully express what they really mean. They might be using words and terms and be able to write it out, but they're not able to actually speak it and hold that conversation. That's what we do at Fluency Fast Track, is working on that difference.
Along with that, the third and last thing that you need to learn a language is paralanguage.
And it's not stressed very much in most English language learning courses.
No, most of the time, the main emphasis, the two big guys that people always talk about is vocabulary and grammar. Study more vocabulary, study more grammar, boom, you're able to speak a language. But if you have spent any time in an English-speaking country, you know that the words that come out of your mouth can be completely perfect, proper words that are spoken, but they still don't fully understand what you're trying to say. That's because there's a lot of stuff that's outside, above, beyond, in front, around the language that you're speaking than just the words themselves.
So paralanguage are all of those things. It's nonverbal language like body language, facial expressions, eye contact, but it's also intonation in your voice. How do you stress your words? And I'm not talking about standard word stress in order to pronounce things properly. I'm talking about how do you put some personality in what you're saying? How do you show that you're being sarcastic versus being literal? But there's also other things that it has. It also has the spacing, the distance that you stand between people, and pauses and the hesitation that you put in your words in what you say, whether you're putting a dramatic pause that's longer or whether you're doing a short one because you're hesitating a bit, you're wavering a little bit. All of that and learning how to read that is incredibly important from culture to culture. Even in different regions in America, our paralanguage is a little bit different. Of course, we can understand each other in America, north, south, or east and west, but we do communicate a little bit differently. Family to family communicates a little bit differently in paralanguage. I think what the assumption is, a lot of people think, well, people will use the body language I use in my culture, just the taboo things, like the middle finger in America is going to be bad, or the bottom of your foot in another country might be bad. But that's not necessarily the case. It's not just the taboo things, it's everything. We can tell the closeness of people or how open-minded somebody is or how serious somebody is just by paralanguage. And that's incredibly important to be able to tap into to communicate well in English.
So the question for you guys is, what can you do now? Let's say you are in another country, or even if you're in an English-speaking country now, and you're finding some trouble with all of these areas. What are some things you can do now in order to make that learning process a lot easier?
If you're going to make it a lot easier, watching YouTube is great. It's better than movies and TV shows because movies and TV shows are scripted. It's meant to be over the top, people be doing everything extra in order to entertain, right? It's better to watch YouTube and try to watch some of the more natural things like interviews between two people or groups of people. Trying to get people walking around the street and see what their body language is, what their facial expressions are when they're asked certain questions. But again, these are edited. By far, hands down, the best thing you could do is actually go or actually have an American friend or somebody you can talk to or meet with on a regular basis and make observations and then ask questions about it. That's the best way to learn paralanguage specifically.
Yeah. And it's a good way to check for vocabulary. So if you are wasting your time by learning all of these medical vocabulary that you will never use a day in your life, don't do that. A lot of times we can find and discover vocabulary that has a large, much deeper meaning and a broader meaning if we just actually interact with people on a regular basis. So that vocabulary you can find by just having that regular comprehensible input that is really valuable, like she's saying, actually talk to native English speakers, but also the grammar. You'll notice as you get better at just being able to listen and parrot what people are saying, you'll start to pick up on the way that they form the language that they're using. So it starts to come in these phrases that you kind of take in, just kind of adopt and use it yourself. But then after a while, you start to play with it and you start to understand that, yes, we can actually put the object in front of the subject and we don't have to make it a passive sentence. We can manipulate the language if we want to for a desired effect. So we can intentionally break the grammar rules if we want to. And you'll likely be able to hear that by people making just mistakes in English, even though they're native English speakers, or they're just trying to be silly or funny. And you can copy that grammar and apply it in other areas.
You cannot underestimate the power of just asking questions. So for you, if you are in a foreign country and if you have the means, hiring an American tutor who's more laid back and just willing to talk with you is extremely helpful. It is so helpful to have somebody just to ask questions. That right there, that alone is going to make your language just shoot up, or your ability to communicate shoot up very high.
In the words of a person that we have interviewed recently, the biggest thing for him was just being in front of a native English speaking teacher and having to speak the language, having to use the language. And that's what we hope that you guys can find, whether it's in the real world or online with a tutor. We hope that you guys can find a way in order to be able to actually use the language that you're learning and be able to understand and see real, comprehensible, quality input.
And specifically talking about vocabulary and how to learn that vocabulary in a way that leads you to fluency a lot easier, especially if you're already high intermediate or low advanced, go ahead and watch the Advanced Vocabulary Study Guide that we did earlier this year. It is very helpful. We walk our students through this same guide. And though it's frustrating because you're narrowed down to 5 words, what you're doing with those 5 words are you're learning synonyms as well. You're learning nuances to those words. You're learning contexts in which we can use them. So definitely go watch that video and print off that guide. You can get it from our website or you can get it from our email list, but it is incredibly helpful.
Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.